So thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning, and thank you to Sammy for reaching out and inviting me several months ago. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to talk a little bit about what is environmental justice, give a brief little rundown on the history of environmental justice here in the LA area, show you some patterns of what environmental racism looks like in LA, and then suggest some possible teaching activities and curriculum projects for you. So when I think about environmental justice, and I should say my definition and understanding of environmental justice has evolved over the years. It's always a work in progress. But for me, I think environmental justice, more than anything, it foregrounds the racial and class dimensions of environmental issues. It's about power, it's about inequality, and it's about struggle, okay? Now the term environmental racism itself, came out of a struggle in North Carolina, Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. And at this particular point in time, I think this was the actual county policy. It was not an illegal act. These trucks were going and dumping PCB-laced soil all around the side of the road in this county. And it was a primarily African-American, but not so at all. There was still a large white population in this county. And the people found out about it, they began mobilizing, and they began engaging in acts of civil disobedience in order to stop what they saw was a real act of violence. Now, of course, this was not the first time that a community of color had been targeted in terms of pollution or other kinds of environmental hazards. But it was the first time that people put a racial framework around it. It was the first time they began talking about this is what we call environmental racism. And so that's where the term comes from, even though many other communities had suffered such problems in the past. It also is important to bear in mind that a large part of kind of the framing, or especially early on for the environmental justice movement and the idea of environmental racism, it really comes from the civil rights movement. A lot of the people that were here in Warren County, North Carolina, and soon different kind of legislators and politicians found out about it, they really have their roots in the civil rights movement. So we kind of see a transfer in terms of framework and concepts over to the environmental arena. This then led to a study, the first study that kind of said, well, look, we know what's happening in Warren County. Is this part of a larger pattern? Can we document it? So this was then the first study that was developed, the United Church of Christ, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, which looked at distribution of different kinds of pollution and waste sites by demographics in the United States, particularly in terms of cities. If we look at it now, it's actually kind of simplistic in terms of the tools, methods, and data sources that they use. The science and the methodology has really changed a great deal. But this was the first time, and it had a huge impact, and it really gave birth to the whole field of the question, at least the scholarship around questions of environmental racism. So the movement develops, it begins to communities and small towns connect with regional and nationally. Eventually, they're able to get President Clinton to sign an executive order, Executive Order 1289, which is also known as the EJ Executive Order, for lack of a better word. And basically what this did is this required all federal agencies to take into account the EJ implications of their various activities and plans, all right? So they were kind of putting it on the radar. You need to pay attention to these issues. And this is like news to the larger world of like the EPA, Department of Interior, Department of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, things like this. So it begins putting these issues on the table. Now, on the one hand, many activists saw this, and it really was a huge achievement, that in a fairly short period of time, they were able to get an executive order passed by the president, which is no small feat at all. On the other hand, many activists point out, it's an executive order. Some people say, well, what we really need is a law. But actually, I'm not convinced a law would actually do much better than an executive order. That's some of the issues I've been researching currently, what I call regulatory failure or noncompliance, and the state's refusal to actually enforce a lot of the environmental laws on the books. But anyway, this is a really important part of the story nonetheless, the executive order and what happened. Now what I want to do, I want to clarify for a moment the difference between environmental racism and environmental justice, because I know it can be a little confusing sometimes. So for me, environmental racism is a subset of environmental justice. It's a subset of it, all right? It refers to one particular form of injustice, in this case, racism. Moreover, it's usually associated with pollution, hazards, toxic kinds of things like that. But in fact, environmental racism exists far beyond pollution. For example, if you've read one of those books that I think Sammy or Jessica mentioned, Environmentalism and Economic Justice, I talk about a case study there involving a group of low-income Mexicanos in northern New Mexico who tried to develop a grazing policy, a sustainable grazing policy that will provide both economic, social benefits to the community. And they were blocked by what they would call the Green Wall, by mainstream environmentalists, by natural resources agencies such as New Mexico Department of Fish and Game, which refused to consider their proposal because they had such a strong anti-grazing ideology, really, going on. And so a lot of those activists saw that as a case of environmental racism, even though it has nothing at all to do with pollution or urban issues at all. We can look at a lot of the rights struggles that Native peoples have for water rights, fishing rights, when they are being blocked by, by white communities or as well as by the state, both locally as well as at the federal level. Another examples of environmental racism. We can talk about discrimination against black farmers, who just like a handful of years ago won a huge settlement because of the systematic discrimination of the federal government towards resources, funding, and different policies towards black farmers. We can look at the limited participation of people of color at the National Park Service, right, and their lands. Carolyn Finney has a new book about that, about African Americans and their relationship, or rather lack of relationship, to the national park lands. So all of these potentially could be forms of environmental racism. So I just want to give you that larger kinds of context. In addition, there's other forms of inequality we can talk about besides just racism. We can talk about class, nation, region, the differences between the global north and the global south, right? Many Native people oftentimes don't even talk about their issues as environmental racism. They say these are really issues about colonialism because we are nations and we are therefore subject to a whole series of forms of oppression by the U.S. nation state, which they see in somewhat differently than racism. Moreover, there's other times we could look at white communities, all right, that are also suffering from really horrendous forms of environmental problems. Here in Southern California, this is kind of far out for most of you guys, over towards the Inland Empire, there was Glen Avon, which was a small community which was destroyed almost by the Stringfellow acid pits, right, which had been years of dumping, particularly by aerospace companies and their subcontractors, all right. So a lot of white people can be impacted also. Or we could look at coal mining, right, particularly workers in the coal mines as well as those communities which have been environmentally devastated, even though they may not see themselves in those terms, right. They may see themselves in very different kinds of terms. But these are all potential kinds of examples of environmental justice that we can talk about. So environmental justice, it also can refer to the movement against environmental racism. That's another usage of the term. It's the movement, the struggle, the people in action against it, all right? And it can also refer to different kinds of policy initiatives, all right, such as what has become known as the executive order, the EJ initiative, as often it's called, all right? So these are policies meant to address issues of inequality and particularly disproportionate exposure in the environmental arena. So environmental justice can really be many different things, but all of them are concerned with inequality, power, and struggle. That's what unites all of them. Environmental justice does not pretend that we are all the same, kind of like, sometimes the way mainstream environmental movement does in their particular kind of narrative. It attends to the lines of difference and inequality that exist in human societies, especially the spatial consequences of that. When we look at issues of segregation and concentration, where we can see really intense kinds of inequalities in the environmental arena. Now, the environmental movement came up with its own principles of environmental justice, and I think there's like almost about close to 20 of them. And these are just 5 of them that I'm going to quickly mention here. The first one is people should be guaranteed the right to environmental protection, which may sound kind of obvious, but actually had to be put into words for it to be really appreciated and understood. Everybody should have that right, regardless of all the standard kinds of differences that exist here in the United States. Second, we should prevent harm before it occurs. Here in the United States, that's not typically how it works. And what they're really talking about here is the importance of having really solid environmental impact reports, environmental impact statements, to identify potential harms and to mitigate them before they actually are making people sick or killing off animals or destroying, biodiversity, things like that. 3, shifting the burden of proof to polluters. This is a really big one. Again, in the United States, the burden of proof is on communities. All right? If you live in a community that has an outbreak of lupus, it is up to you to prove to the courts, to the polluters, to the regulators, we are suffering because of those different polluters. And you are not going to win. All right? Because it is almost impossible to make those kind of causal linkages and analyses. Really, really difficult. In Europe, for example, chemical producers, they must prove a chemical is safe before it's allowed onto the market. And we're the exact opposite here in the United States. We have number 4 is redressing existing inequalities. What the environmental justice movement has been really good at is they've been good at taking existing problems, they've been good at blocking new projects, blocking the expansion of existing projects that are going to go into neighborhoods and create different kinds of hazards or concerns. They've been very effective at doing that. What they have not been effective at is addressing the existent discrepancy and inequality in environmental health between more privileged white communities and non-white communities, and again, between low-income and more wealthy communities. That has been a very, very different kind of struggle, and one that they have is really lagging. And lastly, eliminating the intent standard. So it used to be you could go to court and you could make the case, look at our community is being targeted for these different kinds of problems. Look at the discrepancies, right? We see this percentage of people of color, this concentration of let's say waste sites, and compare that to a white community. In, I think it was 2001, there was a very important case decided, Alexander versus Sandoval. And in that case, the court said, it is not enough to show disproportionate impact. You must show intent. So you must show that the polluter, in fact, tried to go after you and your community because of who you were, right? And again, it's an impossible bar for communities to make that kind of proof. So this is something they have been advocating for, is changing the standard of intent, which is very, very difficult. Now, I wanted to give you a broader context of the possibilities of kind of the universe of environmental justice. Having said that, let's zoom in to talk about Los Angeles. And here in Los Angeles, what we really do have are issues of environmental racism around pollution. I mean, those are really what we're all about. And it's not surprising if you think about it here in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is the leading manufacturing county in the United States. We trade off a lot here with Cook County. Usually it rotates oftentimes between us, Cook County and LA County, in terms of jobs and value of manufactured goods. And of course, there's lots of people of color in Los Angeles, right? Here, this map, basically the darker the shade of red moving into almost black is the greater the concentration of non-white population. So here it's 80 to 100%. So, this gives you just a general idea. So it's not surprising that these two things come together in particular kinds of ways here in Southern California. The environmental justice movement here in LA really starts in the 1980s, and it starts first when I'll only talk about this one because we're so short on time, with the Concerned Citizens of South Central Los Angeles. And this was an effort in the 1980s to place an incinerator in South Los Angeles. At the time, there was no kind of recycling program, and Los Angeles had a trash crisis on its hands. And one of their solutions was to create a series of waste-to-energy incinerators that were going to burn trash and produce electricity. And the first one, guess where it was slated for, of course, was South Central Los Angeles. And they did this in a way which almost nobody knew about, very kind of quiet, But eventually a group of residents did find out, and they began mobilizing around it. And they created the organization called Concerned Citizens of South Central Los Angeles. And eventually, Concerned Citizens partnered with the Urban Planning Department at UCLA, a group of students working on a thesis project. And they very carefully evaluated the environmental impact statement. And what they found is that the consulting firm who had conducted the EIR had not really talked about fly ash and dioxin, which were going to be produced, of course, and spread in the local community. So based on that, they were able to take challenge the EIR, and the city eventually abandoned the plan. So it's a really wonderful example of students coming together with the community and really changing the course of LA history in profound ways. And if you live in the city of Los Angeles and you have recycling, it is also thanks to concerned citizens. Because when they defeated the incinerator project, people said, well, you defeated this, but what are we going to do with the trash? And they said, well, why don't we develop a recycling program? Radical idea, right? And so that's really where it comes from, that particular struggle here. Soon after this, the Mothers of East LA were threatened with an incinerator in Vernon, which is just adjacent to Boyle Heights, and that also was defeated also very soon afterwards. We have the Bus Riders Union, these are the people that took on the MTA, arguing you are running two separate and unequal transportation systems, one for the benefit of primarily middle-class white people, and the other that's serving primarily low-income people of color. And when they challenged it, they also had a really high level of environmental consciousness in their plans and in their proposal, insisting that the bus fleet, which is what they advocated for, you should be investing in buses, that has to become clean burning fuels. And so the fact that we have them in the MTA is thanks to the Bus Riders Union and the work that they have done. We also have the South Central Farm, which I'm sure a lot of you heard about. I took the blue line in this morning, and as I passed it, I could still see that empty 14-acre lot sitting there doing nothing. So this was the largest urban garden in Los Angeles, and under very suspect conditions, it was taken back by the previous owner, and he refused to sell it to the gardeners, even though they raised the $5 million that he requested to sell the land. And so it's still sitting there today. So these are just some of the big environmental justice struggles that we have had here in Los Angeles. Today we also have the, the California Environmental Justice Alliance, which is kind of like an umbrella of different individual environmental justice groups. And they have a really focused, they help support environmental groups on the ground, but they really also focus a lot on climate change, which I'll come back to and talk about in a minute, trying to bring environmental perspective to those issues. The geography of environmental racism in Los Angeles. The red shows you, again, percentages of people of color. The greens are TRI, toxic release facility sites. And so these are, if you, under the law, if you are a facility using a certain amount or a certain poundage of toxic materials, then you must report this to the EPA. You have to fill out forms, say which materials you're using, what amounts, how they are, what you're doing with them, and how they're released. Are they going to the air, water, soil, or what? And so this is kind of the geography of it that we have here in the LA area. And this is actually old data. It's more intense even now. So a lot of people ask, well, how do you know it's racism? Maybe it's about really class. And this is, I think, a very popular attempt to kind of act as if racism is not a persistent feature of the United States culture and society. But in fact, there's been lots of studies done that have looked at that and tested for those different kinds of variables. And in fact, we find, in the case of Los Angeles, race is the most powerful indicator of where different hazardous materials are going to be. And in particular, it is the working class Latino population, which is the most vulnerable and the most exposed here in Los Angeles. It is not the poorest people, all right, that are exposed, because poorest people aren't necessarily living near industry. It's more people who are on the low end of the working class. Those people who are living near industry, which in Los Angeles is overwhelming Latinos, partly because there's a sheer number of Latinos, right? And as well as their general level of poverty that we see here creating this. Another interesting finding from one of my colleagues, Manuel Pastor, who I'll talk about more also, he has found that neighborhoods that have what he calls ethnic churning are especially vulnerable. And these are communities in which there's lots of demographic change happening. And what that means is when there's lots of change like that, communities have less ability to come together and to ward off and to mobilize against these polluters. So communities that are like longstanding Black communities or longstanding Latino communities are going to be slightly more protected than those who are going through demographic transition. All right. I was going to mention Exide, but I won't. How many here heard about Exide? So Exide is a battle, they recycle batteries in Vernon, and this has been the most egregious polluter imaginable. It's not the greatest polluter, it's the greatest violator of pollution laws for the longest period of time imaginable. They've been out of a regulatory permit for 37 years, okay? The AQMD has tried to close them down 41 times since 2003, all right? This is Exide over here, and this shows you this, the dark line here. This elevated cancer risk, 44 times the legal limit, all right? It's just been a spectacular case of regulatory failure here in the Los Angeles area. It's kind of become a joke. You know, if you follow people like, when is this ever going to end? Why can't they close it down, right? What is wrong with these agencies? Finally, in January, Governor Brown actually had to sign a piece of legislation to close them down for not coming into compliance, which I've never heard of this. A governor has to sign a bill to close down an illegal facility, right? I think that says a lot about the level and culture we are in terms of regulatory compliance, right? In terms of what is going on today. So I just want to mention this one. The thing that's really important I want to talk about is cumulative exposure, okay? So we have the case of Exide, who's this really awful, polluter we can talk about. But the way the laws are set up, they only are able to account for a single polluter, all right? Now, if you're one of those people that are living in one of these contaminated communities, though, you're not usually affected by just one polluter. There's a whole collection of them, right? And laws do not take that into account. What we're able to do right now is we're just developing the technology. I shouldn't say we, I don't do this kind of mapping. But my colleague, Manuel Pastor, and his colleagues do. And they've created what they call the cumulative index. And this is one of the first attempts to get a sense about how many different emitters are there in a place, what are they emitting, how hazardous are they, and in what amounts, all right? So in this map here, shows us Exide again. And this very dark color shows us this is the highest level of hazardousness in Los Angeles area that we can have, 13 to 15. And as you see, all of this area is 13 to 15, right? All right. So this shows you the people living in this area, which again is overwhelmingly working class Latinos, are living in one of the most hazardous environments possible. Okay, let me look at this next one. All right. This shows you the cumulative index for Los Angeles County. All right. So what you see around these areas is the green, which is the lowest level of hazardous threat. Then you have yellow, which is intermediary, and then into the red, all right? So what you see here, again, very clearly, is central Los Angeles towards the east side into South LA having the highest, most hazardous environments of all of Los Angeles County, okay? So this is really, in some ways, what I call the environmental racism gap, all right? And that is the difference in environmental quality that communities of color and more privileged communities experience. The difference, the gap, right? And how do we get at that gap? We have actually had very, very little success in getting at the gap at this point in time. In the few minutes that I have, I want to move on to talking about different kinds of suggestions you might consider in terms of working around environmental justice issues in your classroom, okay? The first one is a commodity chain analysis. And I've done this one with college students. And in this case, what I actually do is I have students write a journal of their activities, of what they're doing and consuming. And then from the journals then, I tell them, all right, choose one item. And we're going to focus on that for your analysis, all right? And so then I have them go and research. Where is this item made? What raw materials are used? What does the production process entail? What are the labor conditions? What are the environmental consequences of transporting these various components around the world, right, as well as to the final marketing place where it might be bought? What about the disposal issues, right? So this is getting students to think about these issues in a much geographically as well as socially broader kind of way, thinking through what is going on. And for some of them, they're absolutely just horrendous stuff. I mean, this being one of the best examples, right? The next one is mapping TRI in your neighborhood. And I'm hoping it can come on here. I wanted to go to the zip code here. And you can just type in a zip code, and then you'll get the list of the polluters in your neighborhood, in that zip code or wherever it is. I was going to do 9005. That's, oh, there we go. Look at that. We have none. Hey, you guys live in a clean place. Work here. If you pick, many other zip codes will not look like this, let me assure you. So you could like have students do it for their own neighborhoods, right, or different communities where they're from. And then you can generate a list, you can map it, and then I think one of the really great things you can do then is go ground truthing. And again, this is when you go and you take your maps and you go out on the street and you see where these places are at. One of the things that we have found through ground truthing is we find lots of discrepancies with the data and with people actually observe there. And one of the great things, oh yeah, there you go. There's like my X side showing up there, right? And one of the important things that people have done in the ground truthing, and this kind of gets to the cumulative index thing, is they identify vulnerable land uses and issues. So for example, let's say you have an emitter here, and right next door is a child care facility, right? That'd be considered to be a vulnerable land use. But we have no way of knowing that, right? We have no way of accounting for that within the current regulatory structure. So it would allow students to get a deeper appreciation of how, again, not everybody experiences these things in the same kind of way, and we need to be attentive to these differences in the community and how they are played out, okay? Next one I'll mention here, environmental tours, right? You can do this, again, this is kind of an extension of the TRI, but there's many other ways and you can do this. And I know you're doing an activity with CBE, right? And they've kind of like really pioneered the toxic tour. But there's many different kinds of environmental justice tours one can take. CBE does this, but I know groups in the east side have been doing this on bikes, which has been really, really cool. You can rent a bus, walk, many different ways. And what they're doing here, which you can't tell, I'm sorry, is they're carrying these things called tracks, and they're measuring particulate matter in the air. And they're actually down at the harbor doing this, which of course is one of the greatest, most polluted areas here in the LA County area. So it's a very profound, visceral experience then for students to go and to see, oh, here's what it should be. In this case, it was supposed to be like, I think, 3,000 particulates per square centimeter. And they were getting registers around 25, 30,000 per square, you know. So it's just like radically off the charts, right, in terms of where it's going. And the final thing I'll say here is, you know, the environmental justice movement developed, and a lot of people focus on pollution issues, which we have to, of course. It's very serious. People are dying, all right? Let's not make any mistake about it. On the other hand, at the same time, this other huge problem has been developing at the same time, right? And that is a question of global warming and climate change. And I think for all of us, we are sending our students into uncharted territories. I frankly think there's no way we're ever going to make the two degree mark. We're headed for way beyond that. And when we know we're beyond the 2 degree mark, increase in temperature, we don't know what's going to happen. We just don't know, right? So we're really sending our students off into an uncharted world. We have to stop the fossil fuel industry, right? We got to keep it in the ground, and we got to be working with our students of ways to think about that. The other part of that, which maybe I know may be difficult for some of you public school teachers to talk about, is we got to challenge capitalism. Because capitalism is based on continual growth and expansion. And there's no way that that is compatible with reducing our carbon footprint. It makes no sense. It's, you know, it's, as Jessica told me today what conceptual physics was. It's conceptually impossible in terms of physics to do that, right? So we have this real kind of contradiction here that we are incapable of really talking about. So I think it's really incumbent upon all of us as teachers to be working with our students. What are alternatives to using fossil fuels? How can we shut down the industry, all right? How can we disinvest? I know Bill McKibben the other day was arrested for doing an individual protest in front of an ExxonMobil gas station. And I thought, you know, good for you, just like going out there by yourself, because that takes a whole lot of guts, right, to do that. But again, it's a model for all of us. Think what we can do together, right? So I think we really have to push the boundaries about what is politically acceptable in the classroom, in our schools, if we're really going to address this problem of global climate change. And I will leave you with this quote here from Naomi Klein, which I think should be required reading for everybody, right? If we're to collectively meet the enormous challenge of this crisis, a robust social movement will need to demand and create political leadership that is not only committed to making the polluters pay for a climate-ready public sphere, but willing to revive two lost arts, long-term public planning and saying no to powerful corporations. Thank you.